Well, I think we're going to make a start. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for those who have come out on this cold night to listen to more of Barbara's stories and wisdom. Tonight is session 7. We'll be looking at the conquests in the time of the judges. So I'm not going to say any more except to warmly welcome you and those who are joining us from home or catching up later online. You're all very welcome. Without further ado, Barbara, nice to have you back and a Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. Same to you and a Happy New Year to all of you too. Well, tonight we come to not a sequel so much as another commentary on the Conquest. Because last time, just before Christmas, we finished from the book of Joshua with the optimistic idea that the conquest of Canaan was a successful enterprise by the desert travellers moving in unity together under the leadership of Joshua. Joshua, who obeyed all the instructions of their fierce and terrifying God Yahweh, and Yahweh, who was fulfilling his promise of centuries earlier and giving the land to the descendants of Abraham as he had promised. Well, today we'll learn from the book of Judges that this wonderful enterprise was in reality very different. So we must first resolve some of the problems before we can move on to all the stories embedded in the book of Judges, which cover the next 200 years or so of the history of Canaan and the predominance of the Yahweh faith in opposition to all the fertility cults of that agricultural land. The book of Joshua opened, if you remember, with 2 great stories: the capture and destruction of the city of Jericho when the walls fell down, and then Ai. But Ai only after the initial defeat, because a chap called Achan had kept some of the items of Jericho for himself. Success followed, but only after he and his whole family had been put to death. That raised questions among you, and I was asked to comment on the ethics of these stories in the light of our Christian understanding of God, whom we understand to be the God of love. The answer, I'm afraid, has to be no. We must try not to judge events and patterns of thought from long ago by our own modern standards. To do that would send us into debates which are not appropriate for historical stories. We must endeavour to let the stories stand on their own feet and communicate what matters in their own way. Let me explain. Years ago, I sat at the back of an RE lesson in a church secondary school when the new pupils were beginning to read their brand new Bibles with great enthusiasm, and they had reached Genesis chapter 3. And the teacher asked one of them to read, and it was read beautifully. And then there was a pause. The teacher, a very, very good teacher, said, "But it's not true, is it?" And sitting at the back, I could see all the shock waves going through the shoulders of the pupils. Their RE teacher in a church secondary school was saying that the story in the Bible was not true, was it? She waited. And in the silence she said, "But it isn't true, because snakes don't talk, do they?" More silence. And eventually, one tentative hand went up and said, "But miss, there is truth in the story, isn't there?" "Oh, yes," she said, "now we can begin." And off she set with the lesson on Genesis chapter 3. So snakes don't talk is the motive to remember when we're dealing with these old stories. Look for the truth in them and not expect them to be true in themselves as they're told. We must therefore look for truth in the stories of Jericho and Ai, because they have stood the test of time and they've been found worthy of being remembered. For the people of that time, there was a profound truth for them to learn in those events, that when they were totally loyal to Yahweh, all would be well. But if anybody disobeyed, there would be trouble ahead. And this will be the theme now, running all through the Old Testament, even as the prophets gradually taught the people more and more of the character of Yahweh that we would recognize. So far, the idea of a loving God has not even had a mention, has it? Now, do please remember that the book of Deuteronomy, which does talk of love, hasn't yet been found and won't be found for another 500 years. Another issue we need to remember is the prevailing idea among people of long ago that the whole of everything acquired for the first time, the first lamb, the first bunch of grapes, the first victory, and even sometimes the firstborn son, would be given as a sacrifice of thanksgiving to their God. And anything less than the whole was cheating, and that wasn't good either. And please don't forget what we've already covered, that in the pre-literary societies, the spoken word was also paramount and binding. Well, a big problem resolves around Jericho. Jericho has been found to be, by archaeologists, the oldest walled town in the world. And the earliest remains date right back to 10,000 BC. That's a long time before the time we're dealing with. They found plenty of remains, but absolutely nothing that fits the historical time of Joshua. So we have a problem. They've also failed to trace any remains of Ai, which, according to the story, was burnt to the ground. So before we consign them to fantasy, there are two factors to remember. Evidence from Jericho suggests that for several centuries at a time, in between the different civilizations that lived there, in between those times, the ruins remained deserted. And therefore, detritus of the next generation wasn't immediately on top to preserve them. So without that, they would have been scattered by the winds and nothing left for the archaeologists to find. And although no evidence has been found for Ai as a place, the site is so close to the city of Bethel, which is not mentioned in the story of Joshua, but has been explored by archaeologists and found definitely to have been extensively burnt at the time of the conquest. So it raises the question, should we read Bethel for Ai? We cannot know for certain unless more information comes to light in the future. So let us merely ask, what truth are we to learn from these stories? And answer, as the people have said at the time, like all their contemporaries, that their God Yahweh was terrifying if disobeyed, but still worthy of their allegiance because of his mighty power over other peoples. The victory was theirs while they were his obedient people. So now let's turn our attention to the book of Judges. It's very different from the book of Joshua. The first two chapters describe a sudden urge of newcomers from the desert moving into the central areas of Canaan, but then with no united leadership. The different tribes are recorded as moving to the north and to the south independently of each other, and definitely failing to come to the help of each other when in trouble. The newcomers, as we know, gradually began to persuade the people they dominated, many remember who were also related, children of Abraham, that the God of Abraham had proved how powerful he was, adopting them as his own people by all the events which had happened under the leadership of Moses, which of course they had not experienced. But all they had to do was to agree to become members of the covenant faith and keep the law of Yahweh, which meant completely giving up all their own religious practices of worshipping other gods, particularly the fertility gods. The book of Joshua, you remember, ended with the idealistic description of all the people at the great covenant ceremony at Shechem, promising to do just that. The book of Judges, on the other hand, describes the stories of the next few centuries when this ideal situation failed to keep up its momentum. And only when there was trouble were the people reminded of their covenant with a God who could win battles. And significantly, it would nearly always be the central tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh who were the most loyal to the Mosaic faith, built upon, as you remember, the Passover, the Exodus, and the law, which had been accepted as their part of the covenant agreement with Yahweh. The book of Judges belongs to the next section of biblical stories, known as the Deuteronomic histories, in which every significant event was judged by the later time of Deuteronomy according to the law of Moses. It begins with an amazing story of the great struggle between the two distinctively different types of religious ideas, a struggle that was not resolved for many centuries to come. This is a good opportunity to pause and learn a little bit about the differences of these two religious systems, the Yahwist religion and the prevailing fertility cult of Canaan. That is described very often as the religion of Baal. We can describe the Yahwist faith as a linear faith. That is, its time is measured in a straight line of a progressive story, i.e. history, in which every period is unique and developed from the needs of shepherds who depended on the moon for their well-being, giving light in the cool of the night to move their flocks to new pastures. Their year was marked in 13 moon months, and there were always celebrations when the new moon appeared, guaranteeing stability at least for the next 4 weeks. And this tradition of celebrating the first sighting of the new moon has survived for many years in the Old Testament era and even today. In the faith of the Muslims, especially when the new moon starts the festival of Eid in celebration of the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. We must never talk about primitive religions because a lot of them of long ago still survive today. By contrast, in the farming world, the people were stable and concerned with a regular sowing and harvesting of their crops, year after year, in the same fertile place. So their time was measured in circular time, with the seasons rotating in their right order. And they celebrated 4 festivals each year according to the movement of the sun. The 2 equinoxes, times for planting and harvesting, and the 2 solstices, especially the winter one, when they were assured that the dying sun would return with its heat for the next year's crops. You see, the dying and the rising are very prominent in both systems, an idea that will come, of course, when we get to the resurrection. Of these, we shall be mainly concerned with the spring equinox, their New Year festival, during which the king and queen, or the leaders of each community, would act out the mythic story of their gods, with music, song, and drug-enhanced dance, until in a frenzy, everyone would indulge in sexual activities to urge their gods to enhance the fertility of the seeds being sown in the fields. Needless to say, this was a very popular festival for them and a great attraction for the Israelites, who could only watch rather enviously. And all this, you remember, was the background to the story of Abraham in the orbit of the moon city of Ur, and he left when the king of the sun city of Babylon overwhelmed the area and imposed the religion of the people his religion on the people of Ur. But the greatest difference of all between the two religious systems is that in the Mosaic faith, it's always Yahweh who is in charge. Whereas in the fertility cults, it was the dramatic activities of the kings and the priests which were needed to urge the gods to action on their behalf. You see the subtle difference? The subtle difference, but a big difference. Yahweh in charge, or the people in charge urging the gods to action. And today, it still exists, and I witnessed it once in northern Thailand, in the city of Chiang Mai. The spring festival, known as Songkran, was when the dry season was getting perilously disastrous, and they needed the rains to come. And the people have ceremonies lasting over 3 days, mainly of which they sort of spend the daytime tipping bowls or buckets of water over everybody they possibly can, just to say, we need the water, please water, please water. They have their entertainments in the evenings, dramatically portraying the stories of all their gods. And on the second day of the festival, they go into the river, which is very, very shallow by then, and they live in the river for the day, and they jump up and down and say, look how shallow it is. And that night, they send up the biggest fireworks I've ever seen, far, far, far into the sky. Wake up, you gods, it's time to rain. And when I skeptically asked, and will it? They said, oh yes. And sure enough, the fourth day, bright and sunny, hot as usual, until 6:15 in the evening, and all of a sudden, the clouds came up, the rain came down in stair rods for 15 minutes, and it stopped, and the sun came out again. And those people dare not go through all those ceremonies to the gods, in case it doesn't happen. And you can understand their reasoning. And I witnessed that, and it goes on today. Well, that's the Songkran festival in Chiang Mai. Back in Canaan, though, where the prevailing fertility cults was that of the Baal, each cult was built around a mythic story, and it's from the clay tablets found in Ugarit in 1934 that we have the fragments of the many stories of the Baal. Sadly, they're very confusing, but from them we can recognize some of them. Let's have a look at some pictures. First of all, I've put up a map, and I don't know how clearly you can see it, but on the table over there are paper copies of it, and please take them away with you. And it shows most of the places that we talk about in this series of the course. But let's go on. There's a statue that's been found and identified by the experts as the great god El. We've talked about him before. The great god that is above all the others. The one who sits as chairman of the council, who does very little himself, but oversees what the others get up to. That is El, the chief god, and it's spelt E-L. And if you look through your pages of your Bible and the Old Testament, you'll find ever so many names that either start with El or finish with El. And that's identifying the person with the God they served. Well, that's El. Here we have two. The statue on the right is a statue of the Baal, a very fierce Baal. If you can see the outline of the picture carved in the stone on the left, it shows a sideways picture of Baal with a tremendous rod in his hand, because he was thought to be the god of thunder and the rain. Surprisingly, getting two religions rather close together, aren't we? So that's the Baal. But you can't have sexual activity without a female. So there are plenty of those around. On the left, you have a stone carving in relief, and these female gods have various names. We're going to meet them nearly always as Asherah. We've already met Anat, the goddess of the Hittites, in Turkey, Anatolia, still got that name. And on the right, the more familiar version of a fertility goddess with all her sexuality on show. So we have Baal and the Asherah. Baal, the Asherah, and that's all for the time being. One of these, the stories in the Ugaritic tablets are not very clear, but we can make out El, the Baal, the Asherah, and the god Mot. I haven't got a picture of him, but he was a god of sterility. Oh, otherwise death, of course. And one story suggests that Mot killed Baal in a battle. And when you think for the truth in that story, Mot, death, Baal, the fertility, there was drought. Mot had killed Baal. So you can see how we get truth in the story. Well, that was the story, and it continues with Anat, the goddess, going to find the dead Baal and bringing him back to life. And here we have this motif, a dying and rising God. And it's a very important theme that lies quietly underneath many of these stories until, of course, we come to the resurrection. It's exactly the same, only that's not a myth. Well, that's for later. But notice all these stories of dying and rising redeemers. Well, this was the common setting for Canaan, and some of these temples, can't call them temples, well, it was a temple in Ugaritic, a properly built temple, but more usually they were open-air shrines, and here's a big one that's being excavated. You can see in between all the sandbags that hold the walls in place, the areas they've been excavating. There would have been a statue of Baal, there would have been a big altar for sacrifices to him, and there would also have been a pole, the feminine pole or the tree, so that this is very much a fertility activity. In contrast, remember, the symbol of the presence of Yahweh was never a statue. It was somehow a spirit, invisible, housed in the Ark of the Covenant. and it had been taken to the town of Shiloh, up in the hills away from all the hustle and bustle that was going on in the country. But it was still there, and thank goodness it was. But after all that, we'll turn our attention to the many stories, some good and some not so good, embedded in the book of Judges with a little more sense of understanding. Well, as the newcomers to Canaan gradually began to speak the same language, learning from their neighbours, and began to learn from them how to grow crops and enjoy a much more lavish lifestyle for themselves, they also began to intermarry with them. Inevitably then, they began to enjoy all the jollifications of the Baal religion with their wives. Imagine that sort of in comparison with our modern festival of Glastonbury. Crowds of people all enjoying themselves. Just imagine that atmosphere. And that was to be very similar to the attractive jollifications that the incomers were witnessing. And very attractive they must have been too. Inevitably then, the differences between the two religious systems soon began to be rather blurred. True, Yahweh was still very good when there was danger and battles had to be won, but battles didn't help crops to grow. They tried to use both. The Yahweh faith, though, would brook no rivals, so there really was going to be trouble ahead. The Deuteronomic editors of long after have set out their principles in chapter 2 of the book of Judges, and subsequently surrounded each story with their literary framework. It's like a frame round a picture, the picture being the story, and the framework being at the top and the bottom, the beginning and the end. And the framework is easily recognizable when you're reading the first book of the book of Judges. And the first example comes in chapter 3. The Deuteronomic framework begins, "The Israelites did evil in the sight of Yahweh, forgetting Yahweh their God and worshipping the Baals and the Asherahs. And therefore the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the next enemy." The first one was King Cushan of Aram. And the Israelites served Cushan for 8 years. And then they cried out to Yahweh, who raised up a deliverer for them, Othniel by name. And the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went to war, and Yahweh gave King Cushan into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan. Back to the Deuteronomic framework at the end of the story. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel died. Verse 12 begins the next story. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh strengthened the hand of King Eglon against Israel. And we're off into the second story. Some judges were better than others, but the pattern is always the same. Every judge was a military leader, and some were also administrative and legal judges. The next one was Ehud, a left-handed diplomat, whose sword was unsuspectingly strapped to his right thigh, and therefore unnoticed. When he arrived at the court of King Eglon bringing tribute, he persuaded the king, who happened to be very fat, to give him a private audience. And in that private audience, he drew his sword and stabbed him to death. He locked the room quickly, made his escape before the dead king was discovered, as his courtiers thought he was on the loo and didn't want to disturb him. So Ehud got right away. Chapters 4 and 5 tell the parallel stories of Deborah and Jael, two women, one in storyteller's prose and the other in very primitive poetry, which is likely to be almost contemporary with the events it describes. The story itself describes the offensive of King Jabin's general Sisera. He led the armies against the Israelites and against their general Barak, who'd been commissioned by Deborah, the prophetess, who was also the judge in Israel. And Deborah had enough authority to summon 10,000 men to go with them to fight. But the odds were against them because Sisera had command of 900 chariots of iron. Remember, the Iron Age is just coming in with the help of the Philistines. But the poem in chapter 5 tells us that the army and chariots of Sisera were thrown into confusion by a violent storm, which flooded the river and swept away the chariots. So we have another victory thanks to the storm. Do you remember the story of Joshua? The hailstorm won the battle? Here's another. It flooded the river and swept away the chariots, and the story in chapter 4 continues with Barak pursuing the enemy and killing many of them, while their general Sisera escaped in the confusion. He was given the sanctuary by Jael, who treacherously killed him with one of the tent pegs, which he hammered into his temple when he was asleep. And Barak arrived only to find his enemy already dead. The poem in chapter 5 is known as the Song of Deborah and is considered to be one of the world's literary treasures. The poet, or was it a poetess, to be ranked alongside Homer for importance. Its style is very economic with words and staccato in its rhythms. Its language is very primitive early Hebrew, like some of the Ugaritic tablets, and even the oldest of our Psalms. And therefore, the experts agree it's likely to be contemporary with the events. And the archaeologists suggest that that was about 1125 BC. The story is similar in the poem, but the poem comments on which tribes were involved in the battle. There were lots of them, but interestingly, there's no mention or criticism of the tribe of Judah, which was absent, probably because Judah was cut off from the others in the south, cut off by the might of the stronghold of the Jebusites and their city of Salem, or we would say Jerusalem. The poem finishes with two pictures of contrasting women. Jael, who killed Sisera with a mallet and a front peg, ending, and to give you just a flavour of the poetry, I quote, "He sank, he fell, he lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank. He fell where he sank. There he fell, dead." The other woman, unnamed, is a very different sort of woman. A gentle, confident mother, the mother of Sisera, who assumed that while she waited that he was delayed because of all the booty that he had won inevitably in the battle. Well, after another 40 years of peace, more troubles erupted, this time from the Midianites, who terrorized the Israelites and their lands, making surprise attacks and destroying all the crops in the fields and making off with the livestock that they could find. A prophet, that is a spokesperson for Yahweh, arrived and reminded the Israelites of their errors in relation to Yahweh's law. And then Yahweh's angel arrived, where Gideon was threshing a little wheat secretly in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Gideon was very reluctant to hear his commission from Yahweh because he was of very little importance. But he was assured by the angel that Yahweh would be with him. Gideon responded and offered a meal to the angel, a meal of hospitality. But when it arrived, however, the angel did not eat it. Instead, he merely touched the meat and the cakes with his staff, and they burst into flames before the angel vanished. And again, this principle that angels do not eat with people is a motif that appears again and again throughout the Bible. Mainly in the story of Tobias and the angel Raphael, and much later again in the Gospel of Luke, when to prove that Jesus, the risen Jesus, was not an angel, he asked for something to eat. They gave him bread and a piece of fish, and he ate it before them. See how these things begin to tie up? Interesting, isn't it? Back to Gideon. Well, inspired by Yahweh, Gideon did the most outrageous thing imaginable that night. He secretly went out and destroyed the altar of the local Baal shrine, then cut down the sacred pole and used the wood as a fuel on a new altar on which he erected to Yahweh and sacrificed one of his father's bulls. Next morning, the locals were horrified. It didn't take them long to find out who the culprit was. They went to his father and demanded Gideon's death. But his father, Joash, bravely defended his son and told the people that if he were to die, it should be the Baal who killed him, not them. And at this point, Gideon was now given a new name, Jerubbaal. And only yesterday morning I read my emails and found one from the Archaeological Society saying they had found a new stone in Israel, in the archaeology of Israel, and the inscription on it is just that, Jerubbaal. That's all they said, but they found a new stone. You see how new evidence is continually being found, and then it has to be assessed and put into the picture and assessed to see how valuable it is. Anyway, probably a contemporary stone with a new name of Gideon on it. But when the Midianites and their allies gathered for a massive attack against Gideon's community, Gideon sent out a call for reinforcements. And so very many responded that time that there were too many. First, he sent home all those who preferred to go home, not fight. And still too many remained. So he made them all go down to the water in the river to have a drink, and he watched them. Then he sent home all the ones who knelt down and lapped the water like a dog with their mouths in the water. He kept the more wary ones who kept their eyes on the watch as they lifted the water to their lips, cupped in their hands. He kept a troop of 300 men, and with them set out for battle against the might of Midian. His victories were so spectacular that the tribes begged Gideon to become their hereditary ruler, in other words, a king, and for his family to be kings after him. But he refused. He refused, saying that Yahweh was their king for all time. He lived in peace for the rest of his life. But when he died, his son Abimelech seized the opportunity. He went to Shechem and told the people that they could make him king, He'd taken the precaution of killing all his brothers first, so there would be no opposition. Only one brother survived. His name was Jotham. He escaped the slaughter, but went to the top of Mount Gerizim. Do you remember that was the mountain outside Shechem? And called down to the people and told them the first parable we have in the Old Testament, the parable of the bramble that nobody wanted, nobody thought was important, and took over the whole forest. Abimelech. He told that parable, at least Abimelech told that, Jotham told the parable, and then he fled for his own safety. It took 3 years, and the people were so cross, disappointed, they rebelled against Abimelech in Shechem and killed him. After that, there was a total breakdown of authority in the area for several years, even after they had killed Abimelech. The next enemies to challenge Israel were the Philistines. Now, they were beginning their expansion now into the land from the coastal area plain in the west, and at the same time the Ammonites crossed the river Jordan and attacked from the east. And when the Israelites cried to Yahweh for help, the new leader to emerge was Jephthah. He, with the help of Yahweh, won a great victory over the Ammonites, having first made a vow to Yahweh to sacrifice the first person who came to meet him on his return home. He returned victorious, only to be met by his only daughter, dancing with her tambourines to beat her dad. The end of chapter 11 is a tear-jerking story told with great pathos. The spoken vow could not be revoked. The girl begged for 2 months' grace to be able to wander the hills, and then she returned to be killed. Trouble continued. First, the people of Ephraim killed Jephthah. He was followed by several other judges, but the Philistines were beginning to be the most dangerous enemy, causing trouble for the next 40 years. Chapter 13 in Judges contains a delightful birth story. We're getting used to these, aren't we? This time, the father and the mother, who were childless, were given a child unexpectedly and called him Samson. He didn't recognize Yahweh's messenger was an angel until he wouldn't eat with them. But they did bring up the young Samson to eat nothing unclean and drink no wine. Neither was he to cut his hair. He grew up to be extraordinarily strong. Great expectations here. He killed a lion with his bare hands. When he was on his way to marry a Philistine woman, much to his parents' concern, he later found a bee's nest in the carcass of the lion. And at the wedding feast, he challenged everyone to solve his riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. His bride eventually persuaded him to give her the answer, and then she betrayed him to all her kinsfolk. And Samson's revenge was to set fire to the wheat harvest. In return, they killed his new wife and all her family. What a disappointing end to such a big beginning. Well, it wasn't the end. Samson was a strong force for anyone to reckon with for 20 years. But his next wife was another Philistine, Delilah, and she was his downfall. She wheedled from him the secret of his great strength, and he told her it was his long, uncut hair. And she cut it while he slept. And in his weakness, the Philistines were able to capture and blind him before putting him in prison. There, as he languished, of course, his hair grew again. And at a big festival, he found his strength had returned. And one day at this festival, he died, causing great destruction to the pillars of the shrine of the Philistines' god, whose name was Dagon. An exciting story for Hollywood, maybe, but very little theology. And the years of oppression and lawlessness continued, while the Israelite tribes fell out bitterly with each other. There are several other stories in this book, none of which describe any improvement in Israel's life. It portrays a very low ebb for the YHWH faith. There were no more saviors, and the book ends on a sad note, and I quote, that in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Quietly, though, the Ark of the Covenant was still installed in its shrine at Shiloh. The remains of the town of Shiloh being excavated, of course. And the next slide will show you the picture, the whole area, and the remains of the shrine that they've been excavating in the foreground. Well, the shrine at Shiloh still existed, hidden in the hills and almost forgotten, but not quite. Well, we hope for better stories next time. We'll meet here again next Sunday, 16th of January, not at 4 in the afternoon, but at 4:30. 4 p.m. was my mistake. So thank you for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It doesn't end on a very positive note, but come back next time and it'll all be better. Thank you. On the table, just here, are the notes for this session, an analysis of the two systems of religion that I've described, the linear and the circular, and the map of Israel, which you can take home and you can see more easily the names of all the places that we're talking about. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And I found that absolutely fascinating. Just to be able to get a grip on the whole book of Judges was really helpful.
It took me a long time. But
I'm sure it did. There's a lot of detail there, and you've done a wonderful job of condensing it down. Thank you so much. I couldn't help but hear the story of Samson, though, without picturing Lyle's golden syrup in front of me. You know, yes. Out of the strong came forth sweetness. Yeah. Always a favourite in my house. All right. Well, God bless you, and thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.